Hey, and welcome to the highlights of episode number 257 with Sir Ken Robinson. Some of my favorite parts of this episode were when he talks about whether schools are killing creativity. I also loved it when he talks about what is creativity and why it's so essential to our lives and how to cultivate creativity in your children and yourself. But there is so much more wisdom and inspiration that you get in the full episode. So to listen to the full podcast and get all the info in the show notes, head on over to melissaambrosini.com/257 right now. Ken, it is so great to have you on the show. So can you take us back and tell us your story and how you got to where you are today, doing the work that you now do? Like, how did this all unfold for you?
I grew up in Liverpool in England in the 1950s and 1960s. And I had an interest in school in drama and in visual art. But I wasn't really allowed to do any of those things properly because of the way the curriculum was organized. I didn't think very much about it, truthfully, but I did eventually go to college and I studied English and theatre. When I left college, I was at this wonderful place in Yorkshire called Bretton Hall. And then I applied for it and I was offered this studentship to move to London and to do some research in the area I liked, which was about drama and school and education. And I did that. And then I got involved in a big national project, and one thing led to another. But the reason I was interested in it all in the first place was because I always had this sense that education didn't really serve them very well. It didn't serve very many people very well, and that seemed to me to be altogether a kind of catastrophe for people. Anyway, that was just what interested me, and I eventually got a job on a research project in that very area, and we published a book, and I was asked to go and talk about the book, and I ran a lot of workshops, and one thing led to another. And I think this is how it tends to work for people, that if you have a set of interests, a kind of magnetic sense of direction, and you move towards it, and you're kind of diligent about it, things start to unfold and it's doing the next thing that looks interesting, which is really what I did.
And so your TED Talk, Do Schools Kill Creativity, which is how I kind of stumbled across you, it's been viewed around, I think it's 6 million times. Is that correct?
It is not correct, Melissa. It's been viewed about 62 million times.
My goodness.
Yeah. Actually, what's interesting about that number, is that, it's the most viewed talk in TED's history. But also, I know it gets shown at conferences and events and workshops all the time. You can probably multiply the download figure, which is around 62 million.
Wow.
There's some multiple, maybe 10, to get the actual number of people who've seen it. Yeah. Yeah, it's very interesting, isn't it? It's really spread.
I want to hear your thoughts on whether you think schools kill creativity and what we can do about it. So can you talk to that?
Yeah, I mean, the title of the talk was given afterwards by TED. I think it's a good title. It's a question, not a statement. And you're right to put it that way. It's Do Schools Kill Creativity? Sometimes people say the talk's called Schools Kill Creativity. They don't always, but more often than not, I think they do. It doesn't happen deliberately. I don't think it's an intentional policy, but it's the way it works out because of the way school systems work. Education is a relationship. And the thing we remember most about our time at school are the teachers, the people who lifted us up or the ones who knocked us down, as much as the kind of rituals and routines. And it's the rituals and routines that I think are the problem. And there are lots of misconceptions about creativity. If you ask people if they're creative, if you ask adults if they're creative, very often they'll say they're not, or they'll underestimate their creative capabilities. One of the reasons is that very often if you ask people if they're creative, they think you're asking them if they're artistic. And, it's not to say that being artistic, it doesn't involve creative ability. Of course it does. But creativity is a much bigger idea than the arts. I'm a lifelong advocate of the arts. I mean, I was professor of arts education, but you can be just as creative in science, in mathematics, in cuisine, in any area of human activity. As I see it, creativity is one of the defining features of being a human being. We don't live on the earth the way other creatures do. We live in virtual worlds. We live, within worlds of ideas and theories and cultures and values, and social networks. And the reason is that we are essentially creative. What I mean is that we begin with a very profound power of imagination. We do it all the time. We fantasize. We think of alternative possibilities. It's just natural to us. It's kind of bread and butter to the way our minds work. Creativity comes from that. It's not quite the same thing. Creativity is putting your imagination to work. It's applying it and doing something practical. What we all know is that from the original idea to what eventually comes out, it can be quite a journey. And what eventually turns out may not be quite what people had in mind. It's true if you're composing music or developing a mathematical theory. But it's how human culture works. We are driven by our capacity to have ideas and to put them into practice and to work them into practice in some ways. So it couldn't really be more important, I think. It isn't some exotic power. Creativity is the pulse of humanity. And my great concern is that we too often fail to recognize that. Our children are born into the world with all these powers. Education is one of the ways that we're meant to develop them. And for historical reasons, largely, our education systems have evolved in such a way that they, at the very best, they marginalize these capacities. And at their worst, they actively suppress them. So it, to me, is a very big deal.
So if someone listening has children, or they might be listening and they might be at school, what are some things that we can do to really cultivate more creativity? And, what are some things that we can do? Like, what advice do you give to people that may be currently going through the school system?
Well, I'm often asked, by parents about what they should do for their kids at school. And I've got two children of my own. My wife and I have a son and a daughter. I mean, they're not kids, to the outer world anymore, but of course they are to us. They're 34 and 30 now. So we've been through this very practically. So I published a book recently. It's called You, Your Child and School, which isn't only about creativity. It's about what kind of education do our children need these days if they're to flourish. And, there are various strands to this. One of them is to recognize how different each child is. Even identical twins can be easily told apart by people who come to know them. And this is important because every human being is unique, that every single life has been different. And the reason is we create our own life. And it happens firstly because we're born into the world in a particular way. I mean, no child is a blank sheet of paper. Any parent knows that. There's a lot of nonsense that used to be talked about children come in as a blank sheet of paper and life writes its experiences on them. I mean, it's absolute nonsense. I mean, children come in fully loaded. Any parent listening to this knows that. You wait to discover who these people are that you brought into the world. So there's that. We come in with all our different sort of interests, predispositions, personality, characteristics, and eventually, talents will start to show themselves. By talents, I mean a kind of natural capacity for something. We all have them. So education is really very important. And it's not just about creativity. It's about recognizing that on the one hand, we were born with an array of talents. And secondly, that we have a unique set of interests and dispositions. So you need an education system that helps children, explore all of that. I see the purpose of education in two ways. One is to help children understand the world around them. And the other is to help them understand the world within them. And I think both sides of that are important. So I always say to parents, you should be looking at schools that offer a much better chance than otherwise of fulfilling those two roles. So finding what it is about your own child as the child grows that's interesting about them, that's characteristic of them, and then looking for opportunities for them to at least be able to pursue those things, to be able to discover more about themselves rather than just go through a narrow prescribed curriculum that's been set through other interests. I think that's the first priority.
If someone is listening and they, you mentioned before, finding schools that really can support those things, if for some reason people cannot move schools or that's the only option they've got, is this then something that the parents really need to take ownership of, like, harnessing this in their home time with their children?
Yes, it is. And it's worth remembering that the home is as much of an influence on how children grow and develop as the school is. Now, you have to tread a careful line here, I find, because there's a tendency, I think, for parents to get over-involved with what their children are doing. Do you know what I mean? That the phrase that's often used for it is helicopter parents. And it's the tendency to kind of manage every aspect of a child's lives for them. The fact is that, children need a good bit of freedom as well to become themselves. They don't need to have every minute of the day taken up with organized activities. Over-parenting can be as damaging in its way as neglectful parenting. The second thing is it's important to have a constructive partnership with the school. So, it isn't just a question of kind of bouncing along to the school with a complaint every time your child doesn't get a part in the play or doesn't get picked for the team or doesn't quite get the grade you expected. I think, it calls for a more responsible and subtle relationship than that.
Any other tips in the book that you can give us? Any really big ones?
Parents are very concerned these days about how much time their kids spend online and with digital technologies and what to do about that. I mean, and schools have this debate too, about should they be able to tell their children to turn these gadgets off. And it is important to think that through. Firstly, digital technologies are here. They're not going anywhere. It's like electricity. There's no point trying to wish them all away. They're there. And they have tremendous benefits in terms of learning and education. It's an extraordinary bounty that we have access pretty much to any sort of material. There is also a downside, which is that the technologies themselves, the gadgets, are not really the point. The gadgets will just get better. What lies behind them is this entire world of commerce, of advertising, people trying to seek advantage, people promoting ideas, some people being predatory. It's like any mass medium. And it behoves parents, I think, to recognize that along with all the benefits, there are actual, certain, palpable dangers on the internet. And I think parents are properly informed by instincts here to protect their kids from what could be, real source of harm on the internet. We're not going to wish it away. Schools who are responsible have proper policies about this. They explain issues to kids. They deal with it sensibly. They have sanctions where it becomes a problem, and so they should. So, it's certainly right and proper that parents are vigilant around that, just as schools ought to be, because it's a source of harm that we want to protect our children from, and so we should. Partly because of the proliferation of online activity and the amount of time kids spend online, and combined with the pressure at schools, is that children don't do what they always used to do, which is go outside and play.
Do you know, I just wanted to say it's not just for kids too. Like I need to play. I need to be outside. I need,
Absolutely.
It's for everybody.
Yeah, it is absolutely. It's vital for social, it's a vital part of social development, emotional development. It develops kids' understanding of how the world works. Our bodies aren't incidental to us, and we need to grow strong and healthy. And working with the school on homework is another big issue. Kids get too much homework in most schools, and particularly in high schools. I think it's become kind of crazy. Well, there's absolutely no evidence that it does them or anybody else any good. That a reasonable amount of homework may be okay, but too much simply adds to the stress and the anxiety, not just of the kids, but of course of the parents. It's important to realize, what we ought to be trying to get done here. And if we want our kids to have a balanced education that really does cultivate their talents, then, looking at the environment we provide at home is important. And, working to create a constructive relationship with the school is the other side of it.
Absolutely. And you also mentioned before sleep. And again, I feel like, that's so important for us as well, not just our kids.
Absolutely. People are largely sleep deprived these days. Sleep isn't some incidental luxury, that we should take when we can. It turns out, of course, that sleep is a vital part of our overall growth, development, and emotional and mental well-being. And so just giving ourselves a break, getting back to some sense of moderation where we get the benefits of digital technology, but it doesn't get in the way of having a decent night's sleep. I think that's something we should be thinking about.
I know everyone's definition of success is different, but what do you attribute your success to?
In my life, I've I've been doing things which I feel have been in some way important, not just to me, but to other people. And I think that there's a general principle here, really, and I think it's pretty well established, that fulfillment is and well-being are more helpful concepts than happiness. If you ask most people what they want in their lives, they might, as a reflex, say, no, I want to be happy. When people say they want to be happy, the difficulty with it is that happiness in itself can be a fleeting thing. It's like a moment of exhilaration. It's like laughter. It's in the moment and it can be great, but it's a fleeting thing very often. But fulfillment and well-being are broader concepts. They're to do with having a purpose in your life, having a sense of meaning, having a sense of service in a way. Happiness isn't just something that we find inside of us. It's something that or well-being and fulfillment is something that comes about when we feel that we're connecting with others and being of service to them, that it comes from our connections, not from being solipsistic. And sometimes, the search for happiness ends up being very self-centered, whereas the experience of fulfillment more often than not comes from feeling that you're being of value to other people as well. I have relationships with people that I value. My wife and I have been together for 40 odd years now. Can you blame her, Melissa? I think not. If you do something that you don't care for, you could be physically fine, but spiritually on the ground. But if you do something you love, you could be physically exhausted, but exhilarated by it. If you do something that you love, if you're, so to speak, in your element, you get energy from it. It doesn't take it from you. I mean, spiritual energy. It feeds your energy. It doesn't exhaust it. So it's always a good guide to me. If you're feeling fulfilled, it's to do with having found work or activities or relationships that feed your energy. The world is too obsessed generally with, particularly in America where I live, with the idea of making a lot of money and having a big house and all of the above. And if we know anything, we know that's not the road to fulfillment. I mean, obviously, we'd prefer to live indoors and be able to eat. But nonetheless, there's no direct correlation. There are plenty of miserable people with plenty of money and plenty of very happy people with very little. And so finding those things that feed your spirit, that feed your soul is very important. And those things have to do with discovering your own authentic talents and developing relationships that matter not just to you, but to the people you're having them with.
Absolutely. What is the best piece of advice you could give on relationships?
Just find somebody great. It's certainly in my 20s, and I find it still with people of that age, there's a terrible tendency to see relationships as a kind of soap opera, a kind of constant, like, where are we going with this? What's happening with us? Maybe it's just in Los Angeles here, but people spend an awful lot of time analyzing the ins and outs of their relationships when actually probably, sooner or later, you've got to face up the fact that this just may not be the right relationship. And, certainly that I found that. So there isn't any real secret to it. It's just finding somebody, and there's a lot of it's, the way the dice falls, I guess, that you recognize fulfills and completes you in some way, and that you do that for them. And then getting out of each other's way so you can have that relationship.